And it's the same thing that you see here locally. Who are the kids that actually need permanency? Who are the kids that actually need permanency through adoption? It tends to be kids with disability, kids that are older, sibling groups. And unfortunately, what you've seen a lot in international adoption is a demand for kids from other countries that are healthy and under the age of 5. Those are the least likely kids to actually need adoption
Mhm.
as their permanent solution.
Did you finally realize your dream of having a family, only to have your happily ever after turn into a nightmare? Are you constantly second guessing your parenting, anxious about whether your child will make good choices and remain faithful? Have you neglected yourself to the point that it's taken a personal toll on you? Hi, neighbor. Welcome to Anchors of Encouragement. I'm Tim Maudlin, husband, adoptive parent, disciple of Christ, and ambassador of encouragement. I too felt the joy of having a family of my own, and I wish we could be like other families. But I found myself up late at night, anxious about my child's future and asking myself, why is this happening? Am I a failure as a parent? It was only by grabbing a lifeline from God and my friends that I was able to navigate the challenges of adoptive life. And now I can't wait to share everything I've learned with you. My mission is to be your friend and encourager, to throw adoptive parents a lifeline and offer biblical encouragement as you partner with Christ, providing stability as your anchor when you need it the most. If you're ready for real and raw talk with strategies and insights that lead to peace beyond comprehension, so you not only survive but thrive in life's storms, this podcast is for you. Hope and healing are on the way. Hi, neighbor. I would like to introduce you to my neighbor from Seattle, Brandon Stiver. Brandon has worn several hats, but has one vocation: to see God's kingdom come to earth through proclamation and demonstration. A respected leader in the field of global care for children, Brandon is a professor, a podcaster, and has led nonprofits based in the US and Tanzania. A community builder at heart, he has collaborated with organizations from Central America to Southeast Asia. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tim. Great to be with you.
You're in the Seattle area. I believe you said actually Tacoma, but my brother-in-law has lived in Seattle. My wife has visited Seattle. She tells me it's a beautiful place. I've never been there. So,
Yeah, it is beautiful. I'm from Southern California originally,
Mhm.
and there's some interesting differences. You might think that, oh, all West Coast is the same, but there's some differences even between T Tacoma and Seattle and Portland, these Pacific Northwest cities. But if you ever come out here, Tacoma is the best city to go to. So
Okay,
we
cool.
like Tacoma.
Is there skiing out there?
Yeah, if you go out towards the Cascades, for sure you can find skiing. We don't
Okay.
ski. We're more like beach people typically, but yeah, great spots to hike, great spots to ski.
Oh, I would be into the hiking. My wife is a skier. I tried it once, failed miserably, so I gave it up. But I love hiking, so that would be great. It's good to have you here, and we want to get into our topic today. As your bio tells us, you've been involved overseas in work with orphanages. And can you just tell us a little bit about how you got into that in the first place? Your story is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tim. And I am a man of faith, so for me, it really started with just feeling an inclination from God, understanding that God has a heart for children that are going through challenges, children that are in tough places. And so we moved over to Tanzania, just kind of following that inclination. I first went as a single man, and then during my first year there, met my wife who was there on a short trip, and we ended up getting engaged 6 weeks after meeting face to face, which could be a whole story in and of itself. And then we were there together, and we just kept adding kids over our 8 years there in Tanzania. But yeah, initially what led us there was just a desire to serve God and to serve the vulnerable. And this was the 2000s when I first started to feel this sense of calling. And in 2010 is when we moved, or when I first moved there, January 2010. And it was a learning experience. Again, as a man of faith, I understand that everything is discipleship, everything is growing and learning. And I spent the first 2.5 years in Tanzania working at an orphanage. I know that you guys have a lot of adoptive parents that are listening to this
Hmm.
and probably understand a side of what it looks like when a kid has come out of that environment. For me, I was living on the side of, yeah, living in Tanzania and working at a children's home. I was the education director and the business manager, and I was managing child sponsorship, so I was the guy that was, taking the photos that ended up on your fridge, kind of
Hmm.
stuff. And it was a good learning experience. But among the things that I learned was understanding that most of those kids have families of origin that could be taking care of them if given the proper support. In fact, 4 out of 5 kids in orphanages worldwide actually have one, if not both of their parents still alive. So, yeah, you start to uncover some things when you're actually living there. And we also saw that while Tanzania is closed to international adoption, I assume a lot of your listeners, if they, had a kid from an orphanage, we don't really have orphanages in the States. So certainly not in the scale that you see in the global South. But what we there were no family-based type of services at this particular children's home. Yeah, after being at that children's home for about 2.5 years, we left that organization and started a family and community and church-based program that was really promoting kids to be able to remain with their families and for those families to be strengthened and supported. We also promoted domestic foster care and adoption, Tanzanians bringing in Tanzanians. The most local that you can keep an adoption, the better. We did a lot of work with churches and the child welfare department and all of those. So that's what we ended up doing there. But it all started with, yeah, just a sense that God was leading us to go care for the vulnerable abroad.
One of the things you said that struck me when you were discussing your experience in Tanzania was the fact that a lot of these children have biological parents still living. And that's something that I wasn't aware of. I thought when a child's in an orphanage, they might have siblings in other places or might have siblings in the same orphanage, but I always thought their parents were deceased. So, can you elaborate more on that? What's going on that they would find themselves in an orphanage in the first place?
Yeah, it's a really important thing to wrap your mind around. So I think part of it is the kind of cultural narratives that we have kind of developed around what an orphan is. We think of Oliver Twist, we think of Little Orphan Annie, we think of these children that don't have a soul in the world, kind of thing. If you actually go to and you can think there might be quite a few kids, but the other kind of thing that can be confusing is when you hear a stat like from the United Nations that will say there's 140 million orphans in the world. Now, when you get into that legal space, international law and so forth, what they're defining there is both single and double orphans. So, meaning if you have lost one of your parents, you're what is called a single orphan. So, even when you hear these really huge stats, there's 140 million, 150 million orphans in the world. What they're counting is the majority of those have a parent, and the majority of them live with their family. And even if we were to say, okay, well, what about kids that are in orphanages? Well, then the Lancet report a few years ago did a study, and their best estimate is that there's 5.4 million kids living in orphanages. When you kind of dig deeper, and this will vary from state to state, or sorry, from country to country, but when you dig a little further, you'll see that 4 out of 5 of kids in orphanages have one, if not both of their parents still alive. It's kind of like understanding, okay, well, what is an orphan? Because we have this cultural connotation, then we have kind of this legal connotation. And then, well, what does that mean for kids that are separated from their family? And the reality is, even if we think about our foster care system here, I currently work for a domestic organization based working in child welfare here in Washington State. If we think about, well, kids don't just crawl out of holes, and say, I'm an orphan, right? It doesn't work like that. The kids come from somewhere. And often, same with the US, the kids still have family out there, but something happened, right?
Hmm.
So typically the reasons why kids end up in orphanages, it's poverty plus something else, right? So it's poverty. So poverty is kind of a ubiquitous underlying, vulnerability throughout the global South. But then there'll be something else that will also kind of set it off. It could be the kid has a disability. It could be there was some conflict in the home. It could be a desire for the kid to go to get a certain education, so they feel they have to place. And then, of course, there's corruption, and there can be other things that are more nefarious that actually go on too, where you can have people that go on short-term missions trips or volunteerism, and they want to visit orphans, in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. There's a demand, right? So you'll have people that can go out and actually recruit kids to go into orphanages. This also happened when it came to international adoption. There have been different international adoption hotspots over the years, and many of them have closed. Part of that because of the Hague Convention, and but even the Hague Convention is trying to get after the fact that some of these were involved in child trafficking, right? So there's been child trafficking in Haiti. Guatemala has been a hotspot. Uganda even. So some of these places, there's all these different kind of reasons. There is a supply and demand factor. There is a push factor from these kids' families. That's poverty plus something else. But all of that kind of leads to kids needlessly being separated from their families and placed into orphanages. And that's a trauma right there.
Oh,
You and I
yeah.
are both adoptive parents. We know what it feels like, looks like to bring in a kid that's gone through adversity. And adoption is important and it's beautiful. And for many families and for many kids, that is the best solution for them. It's not a perfect solution. It's not an ideal solution, but it could be the best available solution. But many of these kids could have actually remained with their families of origin, and that would have been the better solution.
That dynamic is just surprising to me. I just assumed that they were fatherless, motherless. And one thing, as you spoke about this, I've never asked because I try not to pry into the backgrounds of adoptive families. I think that information is private. It's shared to the children and shared if they want to share it, that's fine. But I typically, from my own experience, just try not to pry. But I've never asked any of the several families that I know who've adopted internationally. I've never asked them, were the parents deceased? I never thought to even ask that because that puts a whole nother layer of trauma of, abandonment to be factored into. So that's just amazing that that's a possibility. Or as you said, 4 out of 5 have at least one parent still living. So,
Yeah, and those are kids in orphanages. Many of those
mhm.
kids are not even necessarily going to be eligible for adoption. And if you look at the trajectory of international adoption, it's kind of been on a 20-year decline. And it kind of bottomed out in 2020 for obvious reasons, but it was already, kind of on that real steady decline in numbers overall. If you were to ask an adoptive parent who brought in a kid from, say, Ethiopia or Guatemala or some of these places where you've seen a number of kids come out of, they may or may not have that information because there's so many layers and so many gaps in child protection
Hmm.
that they're going to say, well, I remember I worked at one point in my career. I've primarily worked in global child welfare, but also in domestic. At one point, I was working for a foster family agency in California. And I remember sitting down with a couple that were looking to adopt from Haiti. And as I was kind of asking them, because they were just waiting and waiting and waiting, I remember asking them and saying, who are you working with? Oh, well, we're working with this social worker. She's, from 3 hours away up in the valley, and she's connected with an agency in Texas. And they're the ones who have the relationships in Haiti, but they're not at the orphanage. And you just kind of get like all of these different layers of people that are involved. And you look at that, I don't want to call it this, but it essentially is a supply chain.
Hmm.
You go down that rabbit hole and you can see, oh, this is how corruption can kind of be manifest within this supply chain so that when you get to that foster or that adoptive parent or that prospective adoptive parent, they may not have any clue, that the kid actually has family, right? And it's the same thing that you see here locally. Who are the kids that actually need permanency? Who are the kids that actually need permanency through adoption? It tends to be kids with disability, kids that are older, sibling groups. And unfortunately, what you've seen a lot in international adoption is a demand for kids from other countries that are healthy and under the age of 5. Those are the least likely kids to actually need adoption
Hmm.
as their permanent solution, right? And yet there will be people, especially when we talk about a system where parents are, or prospective adoptive parents are willing to put in 30, 40, 50, $60,000 into a system where it's based in a country where the average person is making less than $2 or $3 a day. So there's a lot of incentive there, unfortunately. Now, corruption is just one piece of the pie. And I only kind of mention it because it particularly kind of exposes its head in international adoption. But there are a lot of other factors that lead to kids becoming separated from their families.
We adopted domestically, and there are so many safeguards in place to protect not only the child, the adoptee, the birth mother, but the adoptive family. And we just happened to work. I think God led us to this person, this agent's, well, this law firm, where the lawyer helped write the laws for the state we adopted in. So, we felt pretty comfortable that everything was above board and we were going to keep everything in the best light for all parties considered. So I know we were told that international adoption is challenging, especially when you're starting to go into other countries and the laws, and it just gets really complicated. So I understand what you're talking about there. There's one other thing that on this topic I wanted to touch base on. When we were adopting our boys, we tried to get as much information as possible that we could share with them at some point in their lives when they were ready for it, when they asked for it. And you said that sometimes that information is challenging to get with international adoption. Is it possible to dig deeper, or is it just not even available?
Well, it's interesting. So, I mean, I can share my story. I'm also thinking of another friend who's been on our podcast before talking about this. But for us, we actually did not do an international adoption. Tanzania is closed to international adoption. We did a domestic adoption as long-term residents. So essentially, if you're going to adopt from the country of Tanzania, to both sufficiently accomplish the Tanzanian side of the adoption as well as the American side of the adoption slash immigration, you pretty much have to commit to be there for 5 years. Well, we lived there for 8 years overall, so that was not
Mhm.
really an issue for us, and we got an adoption attorney and he helped us finalize. We got an immigration attorney when we moved to the States. Our son is on a green card. So that's kind of how we went about it. For us, because we were living in Tanzania, and because I mentioned how I worked for two different organizations, first working in an orphanage, second working in a family-based model, we were living there. So we were able to actually like meet his extended family. And he actually has more of a relationship with his extended family after the adoption than before. He was able to build relationships with his grandma, cousins, half siblings. And that was important. It's important. And even though we live in the US now, it's still important that he has a good understanding of where he came from, right? And who
Mhm.
those people are. And for him to be able to see other people that love and care for him just weren't able to take care of him for one reason or another. But for him to say, wow, my cousin looks like me, or, those types of
Mhm.
situations, or I have this person here and this person there, it helps kids to kind of put those things together. I have another friend, she adopted from Uganda and they were not living there. It was interesting. I was kind of digging in with her on our podcast, and it was interesting to kind of hear the great lengths that they went to work with his biological family. And he did still have a mom, that was willing, that was involved, but not in a situation where she would take care. And that's
Mhm.
their discernment and their work. But she did go to great lengths. I know of another person that adopted from Uganda, and they brought the girl home. This was like big news and covered in a few different places. They actually ended up dissolving the adoption and returning her back to her family of origin once they learned that she was basically adopted under false pretense. So those are just three stories, right? And if you've heard
Mhm.
one adoption story, you've heard one adoption story.
Right.
So it's not a matter of like every single, family should do this or this, but yes, for sure you should be seeking understanding. You should be doing investigation into the country that you're looking to adopt from. And again, if you're able to adopt domestically, I mean, we have over a third of the kids nationally that have already had, parental rights, relinquished. They
Hmm.
don't always relinquish, parental rights depending on the state, but that are essentially eligible for adoption. Going domestic is best. We went domestic. We just happened to be living in another country when we did it, right?
Hmm.
So domestic is best because there are so many gaps in child protection when you look at international adoption.
There are so many different directions we could, take this conversation. One in particular that I wanted to try to dig a little deeper into, and this is to be supportive of adoptive parents and especially those who have adopted internationally. What are some of the challenges, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, but what are some of the challenges you have personally seen that adoptive parents and adoptees will face from international adoptions?
Yeah, well, there's a few that are obvious and nonetheless very significant. So, one, we are not only talking about situations where the kid has undergone trauma, that's there. We're not only talking about challenges in terms of developing attachment, right? That's pretty ubiquitous for adoptive parents. That's there as well. But then you start to get into some other things that are unique within the international adoption from orphanage space, and that would be institutionalized behavior. Behavior that goes like these kids are not even accustomed to being in any type of family,
Mhm.
if they had some level of attachment with a dysfunctional parent or, if they, had some other, situation that maybe was not the best, that would nonetheless still be within a family, right? When we're talking about getting a kid out of an orphanage, they come with institutionalized behavior. And that's where you can see kids that develop stereotypies. So that's like, the rocking back and forth, the trying to get stimulation in certain ways. And that can, lead to cognitive impairment. So you can start to kind of get into some of the disability space as well. Institutionalized behavior is really significant. You're also talking about a kid from a different culture, likely a different race. And sadly, America does not get an A for race relations or what that looks like, unfortunately. So for us, we are a multi-ethnic family ourselves, and we have to rely, even though our son is not African American, he's just African, we have to rely on Black friends that maybe go to our church or in our neighborhood to give us guidance in terms of, well, what does it look like to raise a Black son, in the United
Mhm.
States? Because I'm not going to, as a white man, I'm not going to assume that I know what that's like. Well, God has given me the opportunity and the privilege and the responsibility to raise my son and to raise him in the way that he ought to go. It is, there are certain things that I don't know. Reaching out and tapping into people in your community is really critical for that. And including, we have other friends that have adopted from China and so forth, that they also have to, cross that racial divide. So, yeah, there's some great resources. We've done, a close colleague of mine is Deborah Gray. She's written a number of books on attachment that I highly recommend. And she's also based here in the greater Seattle area. But there's some great resources from her that have really kind of helped us. And of course, Karen Purvis and a lot of those, TBRI resources can really be helpful when kids have, come out of orphanages for sure as well.
One of the things that I've talked a lot about on this podcast is adoption trauma, and we've already touched on that a little bit here. Adoption trauma, at least in my circumstances, my story, started to rear its head in the teen years. And I don't know how many of these children typically get adopted internationally, older or younger. I think some of the people I'm thinking about who have adopted internationally adopted older children in the teens already. When does adoption trauma start to manifest itself?
When you say adoption trauma, are you mainly referring to like a like trauma resulting from adoption or trauma from the kids history, like before they were adopted, or are we talking like secondary trauma of the adoptive parents? Like, I know that those are all legitimate. I just want to make sure I'm tracking with you 100%.
Well, in my case, we adopted infants. We were actually got them as babies. And what I didn't understand, and this was my being naive about the whole situation, adoption can occur in the womb. And that's what we faced. There were things that we started to notice that in hindsight we go, oh, that's what that was. It was fight or flight because that was wired in the womb. And so that was indicated to us and manifested early on, but it really didn't come to a head until the teen years. Wanted to try to figure out, helping these adoptive parents, what they can look for, signs they can look for, how to anticipate, and how to get help.
Yeah, no, and thank you for expounding on that. That's helpful, Tim. It can manifest at different points. So, I mean, when we adopted cross-culturally and out of a global South orphanage, we had issues right away. That was a lot of the institutionalized behavior kind of
Mm-hmm.
came out, and we had to figure out what do we do about that, right? And then that's where a lot of the cross-cultural stuff. You talk to my son now, you think he's from the West Coast. He sounds like a Californian like me,
Mm-hmm.
and but of course he is Tanzanian. People are often actually surprised to hear that he's actually not an American at this point, but that wasn't the case then. I think that the teenage years are huge. And so when I hear you allude to that, I'm definitely tracking. I think one, biologically, there's different things going on, right? So we are
Mm-hmm.
talking about, okay, this kid has a trauma history. We as adoptive parents have undoubtedly made so many mistakes at different points. We're trying our best often, but we're also coming up short. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what for me, I just have to pray and rely on God's grace and you know make sure I'm connected with my wife and all of that stuff. But so all of that is kind of all in there. And then when you get to the teenage years, it's like, okay, take all that trauma history, take all the attachment, take all the everything, and now let's pump it full of hormones. Well, okay.
Mm-hmm.
That is
Yep.
tough. That is tough. And then especially within our culture here in the US, I think to a certain degree this is normal and natural and is just a part of child development. And in some ways it's actually heightened because of our very rugged individualism in the US. But the adolescent period is a time of finding one's identity. And I think when adoption is something that is critically tied to identity. They want to know, who am I from? I don't look like my parents, and I know I'm not from, this family originally, and all of that stuff tied together. Yes, I do think that the teenage years are very crucial, and when
Mm-hmm.
we talk about getting support to those families, I mean, again, I don't know what we would do at certain points if we weren't tied to our local church here that has helped us at different points. Getting our son and ourselves therapy is
Mm-hmm.
really critical. Connecting with other adoptive parents is really critical. So all of these things have been life-giving to us because hopefully at the end of this, and again, going back to that discipleship lens, God wants to teach me something in this situation. He didn't put us into this situation and then just say, now I'm forsaking you, now I'm leaving you. That's not how he operates. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And I have to be open to what are things that are going to be required of me to grow and what are things that I have to lay down to better serve my child and to better serve my family as a whole. And those are really hard decisions, but that's how wisdom's grown and that's how we can move forward. So,
No, that's a good answer. I mean, again, I'm thinking back to my journey, and God led us to this. And if it hadn't been for Him being there with us through it, we couldn't have made it. And it hadn't been for other anchors of encouragement who were helping us navigate these challenges, we couldn't have gotten through it. And so it's important. And that's really, I said this before on the podcast. Here I am in Indiana doing a podcast on adoption and adoption trauma. Never in a million years would I have guessed that. But I'm trying to connect other adoptive families so they can realize they are not alone. we're in this together. And if we can support each other and we can get support from God, we can navigate these challenges. But it's not easy, but it can be done. And that's the main thing about this. So,
Yeah. No, that's really good. And there are resources out there. I am a big believer in what you were just describing, Tim, in terms of connecting with one another. Not too far from you, not in Indiana, but in Illinois, there's the annual Replanted Conference led by a friend and colleague, Jen Hook. And they actually do simulcast sites throughout the country. And those are really rich opportunities for adoptive parents to come together
mhm,
and to connect and to be encouraged and to hear speakers and to be, yeah, to be loved on, to be encouraged, right?
mhm.
So there's a similar one, the Re-Conference in Kansas City. That both of those were spun off actually by one that was developed by a mentor of mine, Michelle Schneidler, here in the Seattle area that was called Refresh Conference. There are those opportunities and the work that I do now. So my full-time job, I do a number of things as you mentioned in my intro. My full-time job is working for an organization called Care Portal,
Mhm.
and Care Portal is operating in 34 states nationwide. And we also are driving support to vulnerable families. That includes adoptive families, but not only adoptive families, other families that are also going through challenges. So we have to build out those networks, and there are resources out there.
I'm glad to hear these that I wasn't aware of because it is important. I know I've had people reach out to me from listening to the podcast and they said, I'm not alone. I said, no, you aren't. You're not alone. Knowing these and making people aware of these resources is one of the goals of this podcast is to just let people know we have help out there and we just have to know where it is and how to access it. One of the things that I do in this podcast is to end it with a daily doable, some kind of action step that individuals can take to implement what we've talked about. And we've talked about people who have it in their heart to adopt and what they can do. But there's also a segment of the population who, for whatever reason, can't adopt. But as the daily doable, how can individuals who are not adoptees or not adoptive parents, how can they support adoptive families?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna circle back to something I mentioned just a second ago, and this isn't just because I work for this organization, but really because I believe in this organization.
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage listeners to go to careportal.org, and you will see, go to your state, and we're in most states, 35 well, 34 active, 35th is in works. But go to your state or the closest state to you, and just find a real-time need. So we can talk about like, okay, we're talking about, let's say it's a foster family, and the foster family is about to receive a placement, a child, at an age and gender that they've never had before. And in order for the child welfare agency to say, hey, you can, we're going to make this placement into your home, you need to have a bed and you need to have clothes their size, right? So you have agencies that will populate directly into Care Portal. Hey, there's a family in this zip code. It could be your neighbor, right? And they have this specific need. And it gives people in the community or people from local churches the opportunity to respond in real time and either fund that need so that somebody can go and get it for that family, or if they're actually in your county, you can actually, and you're a part of a participating church, you could actually potentially be the one to go and deliver directly that bed, those groceries, that whatever, right? So if
Mm-hmm.
we talk about something that's doable and you don't have to be an adoptive parent to do it, um, Care Portal is something for everyone. And if it's not adoptive parents, not a foster parent, you can do kinship families, you can do refugee families, you can do, families that just exited homelessness. There's actually a ton of families out there that just need support and to be strengthened. And we can do that. We can promote that internationally, as we've talked a lot about on this podcast today. But you can also just do it right around the corner. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of families that are out there in need. So maybe one that hasn't been mentioned on your podcast before, but I would definitely encourage people go check out careportal.org because that's a very doable way to jump in and help someone.
Perfect. And I will put that link in the show notes. I want to thank you for being on here today with us. And as we wrap up, what are the ways for people to be in contact with you, to reach out?
Yeah, happy to connect. I've mentioned a few things. I do teach at a couple universities out here on the West Coast, and I have my full-time job with Care Portal. Probably the best way for people to reach out. I'm happy to just direct people towards my side project, whatever, at Canopy International. So people could just email me directly. I'm happy to point you guys towards other resources or things to be aware of. We've had a podcast for the last several years. A lot of it right now is focused on like global development from a Christian perspective. But our foremost thing that we've talked about over the years has been orphan care and adoption and foster care. So there's a lot of resources out there too. So people are welcome to just email me, brandon@canopy.international. Happy to connect with people, happy to point people towards good work out there.
Okay. And again, I'll put all this information in the show notes and people can reach out to you. But Brandon, thank you so much for being on the show. This information is, I know, going to help other people. And that's what we're about, trying to help them navigate these challenges. So thank you so much for being on here.
It was great to be with you, Tim. Thanks.
I hope Brandon's insights and experiences with international adoption have been as enlightening for you as they were for me. Here are a few of the takeaways. Number 1, poverty and other factors drive children to orphanages. In fact, many orphans have living parents. 4 out of 5 have at least one parent alive. Number 2, to help cross racial and cultural divides when you adopt from another country, it's important to reach out to people in your community who can help you understand how best to navigate these challenges. Number 3, churches, community, and other adoptive parents are lifelines for families navigating the adoption journey. Number 4, the adoption journey is not easy. It's going to require personal growth and sacrifice to better serve your child and family. But God did not lead you down this path to suddenly forsake you. And number 5, even if you are not able to adopt, there are multiple ways you can support adoptive families. Navigating the adoption journey is challenging, but with God's grace and the right support system, it is a path full of growth and fulfillment. Please see the show notes for the resources mentioned and how you can connect with Brandon. That's all for this episode. I want to thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, this is Tim encouraging you to do what you can now. If this podcast has given you the courage and confidence to face storms in your life, the number one way you can thank me is to leave a written review on Apple Podcasts. Tell a friend about the show. Take a screenshot of this episode and share it in your Instagram stories and tag me @TimMaudlin. You can also connect with me in my Facebook group, Anchors of Encouragement. So until next time, this is Tim encouraging you to do what you can now.